Hello friends, and welcome again to a Walk in the Garden Bible study. This is part 2 in our study of Genesis chapter 31. And if you remember from our last lesson, we had saw where Jacob and Laban had some disagreements. And Jacob at one point had wanted to pull up stakes and take his family, and he'd threatened Laban that he was going to take his family and take all of his possessions and leave because he really didn't like the way that Laban had been treating him, and he'd put up with it for way too long, and he just felt like things weren't never going to get better, and maybe it was just time for him to go back and to the land of Canaan and go see his family. And so that's what he had intended to do. And then of course Laban had convinced him to stay on longer and had proposed a plan to give him a raise or to offer him some wages of his choosing. And then we saw where Jacob had set up this plan to go through the animals and pick certain animals that had certain characteristics, and they would be his, and then the rest of the animals would be Laban's. And any future animals that were born, if they had those same characteristics, they'd belong to Jacob. And so over the course of time, Jacob was prospering much more than Laban. And Laban's sons had gotten very jealous because they said, well, he's taking advantage of our father. He's stealing from our father is what they're accusing him of. And he's stealing our inheritance. And that's really at the core of their concern, was this was going to be their inheritance, and it was starting to dwindle. And so there was a lot of jealousy there. There was a lot of anger and envy. And then we saw where they'd pretty much convinced Laban of this as well, because it told us that Laban's countenance wasn't the same towards Jacob. His feelings toward Jacob had changed. His attitude towards Jacob had changed, and Jacob could tell just in the way he was looking at him, basically. And so he could see it in his face, and he knew. And we saw where Jacob went out and he brought his case before the sons that, hey, this was your dad's doings, and you know that the Lord has been with me. The God of my fathers is with me. He's prospered me. And he's caused this thing to happen, and it's because your father has not treated me fairly. He's done things underhandedly, and his thumb has been upon me all these many years. And so what Jacob finally decided to do was that he still felt like he might have to do either further separation or even possibly leave the place and go somewhere else. So with that, we're going to pick it up in verses 17 through 24, and here we read, Then Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon camels, and he carried away all his cattle and all his goods which he had gotten, the cattle of his getting, which he had gotten in Pandanaram, for to go to Isaac his father in the land of Canaan. And Laban went to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. And Jacob stole away unawares to Laban the Syrian, in that he told him not that he fled. So he fled with all he had, and he rose up and passed over the river, and set his face toward the Mount Gilead. And when it was told Laban on the third day that Jacob was fled, and he took his brethren with him, and pursued after him 7 days' journey. And God came to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night, and said unto him, Take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Well, we know that, Jacob had tried to go on his own at one point in time. But when God instructed him, when God spoke to him in a special way, he spoke to him in a dream. And he showed him a vision. And he told him that now is the time. Now is the time for you to return to your father Isaac in the land of Canaan and go back home. Now is the time for you to leave. And so it was under God's divine protection now that he would leave. And what he decided to do, though, was to leave behind the back of Laban. If you remember, Laban had separated himself 3 days' journey. So they had a fair amount of space in between them. And if there was any, they didn't send mail necessarily, but if there was any message that was going to get to Laban, or if he needed to go and talk to Laban directly, well, it was going to be a 3-day journey. And so as opposed to doing that, what do we see here? It says, well, he rose up early, he set his sons and his wives upon the camels and got all his goods together that he had gotten, and they left, but they left unawares to Laban. And so now we see that Jacob's flight from Laban, his uncle. You know, he'd been long considering it. He'd been considering it for a long time, probably many years actually, thinking about it through and through, that one day I've got to get out of here. One day I've got to get out from under Laban's thumb, and I've got to get out on my own. And one day I want to go back to my homeland. I want to go back and see my family. But it had been delayed, and if you remember, his intended course had been delayed and changed by Laban. But now he had had enough. And now it was apparent that he was no longer welcome anymore in this place. And that was just kind of the stamp of assurance upon the whole idea of leaving. You know, God had told him to leave, but, you know, trying to plan and trying to formulate the exact time to leave, well, when he saw Laban's countenance towards him and realized that nothing was going to be the same anymore, that there was going to be a constant state of animosity now, probably it could even come to, possibly even battling each other, then that was just kind of the stamp of approval. And, you know, when many times when God gives you a direction, and, you know, you're still maybe have a little measure of unsurety, or there's just a little measure of, you just want to be convinced, well, sometimes God will put something in your path, or he'll bring something to pass, or he'll put, he'll speak to you through his word, and he'll just put that stamp of assurance on it that now you're totally convinced. He'll bring you over. He'll bring you over that little bit of a hurdle that you still have in front of you. And he'll give you the confidence to go forward in faith and to trust him for the rest of the journey, for the rest of the provision. And so that's what he did. When Jacob saw Laban's countenance, I don't think he was probably as worried about what his sons were doing or what his sons were saying. But when he saw that Laban himself had taken on that disposition, then he knew for a surety that it was time to go. And he knew if he tried to stay, it would definitely not be a pleasant atmosphere to live in. But beyond this, if you remember, God had given him his marching orders. He said, "Return unto the land of thy fathers and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee." So that was the ultimate assurance. God had just spoke to him through his direct word and told him that you can go, and now is the time to go, because I will be with thee. In other words, my approval is on your leaving. My approval is on the situation. And, you just have to leave and trust me for your safety and provision. So he knows the Lord will be with him, and he will be under his divine protection and guidance if he goes. And so what do we see next? Well, it tells us, it says, Jacob rose up and set his sons and his wives upon the camels, and he carried away all his cattle and all his goods which he had gotten. And he was leaving so he could go see his father Isaac and the rest of his family there in the land of Canaan. And so it was that Jacob now called his wives unto him. So when he got God's instruction, and he saw Laban's countenance, and he got the vision of the Lord, and now he knew what he was to do. But he didn't just, blindly lead his family off and say, "Hey, just follow me, we're going to leave now, we're heading out, don't ask any questions." No, what does he do? Well, he calls his wives out. He calls Leah and Rachel, and he wants to have a confab, you might say, a family get-together, a family conference, which isn't a bad thing to do if there's a major decision to be made. Or if you're planning to make a major decision, well, it's good to get the family involved and get them on board with it. And that's just the transparency. That's the transparency of a relationship within the family, not only with the children, but with your wife. And so that you're all in one accord, you're all in congruence one with another. And so he knew that this needed to be done, and he calls his wives out. And he knew that God's call was there, but likewise he wanted to share his intentions with his wives and get their approval on the matter as well. He wanted to make sure they were on board. And so here's an observation we can make about that. Where there's mutual affection, there should be mutual confidence. the trust should be there based on the relationship. And I fear too often that many times couples will, not do things behind each other's back, but they'll just do things rashly without getting input from their spouse. And that just kind of, could ruffle a few feathers, because it shows that kind of a lack of concern for their feelings on the matter, or a lack of concern of what they think about it. And, if two to come together, they become one flesh, then they need to be consulting with one another. And that's how you're going to keep on an even keel throughout the marriage. So Rachel and Leah, were going to be questioned about their feedback. He wanted some feedback from them. And, we're going to see that they're not going to have an issue with this. They're not going to have an issue with his decision, because they very well knew what had been taking place. They knew how their father had been treating their husband. And they also remembered that technically their own father had sold them to Jacob. Because if you remember, Jacob had to work 7 years to gain each of these daughters as his wife. So he worked for them. He earned them. And basically he bought them from their father. So they kind of didn't view that too highly, the fact that they were sold, they were sold basically to their husband. And even though, Jacob reviewed it with them, they knew that he had been just and tried to serve faithfully and honestly with their father. They knew how Jacob's character was. They knew how his dealings was. And they knew that he had done everything in his power to maintain peace and harmony. And even when he wasn't being treated right, he still endured it for the sake of keeping the family relations there. So they knew that their father had treated him unfairly and continuously, in spite that they were his wife. So in other words, in their opinion, their dad really didn't have much consideration for their feelings. He really didn't have much consideration for their welfare, because he didn't have any consideration for Jacob's welfare. So they weren't too happy about the situation as well. And they remembered that they had been sold for a price to Jacob by their own father. And so thusly they entertained their own grievances as well. Because how did they respond? Well, they felt like he looked upon them as strangers. Now, there was no natural affection between them any longer. And they looked upon the wealth which God had endued to them as their portion that their own father would not have given to them. It was almost like he had something against Jacob. And so God had forced their father to pay his debts, both to his servant and to his daughters, in the fact of the management of the animals. And the way that Jacob was able to gain great wealth and great prosperity through God's means, God's not only prospering Jacob, but also his dealings with Laban. And kind of putting that back on Laban, since he was treating him improperly. So they were basically just tired. They were tired of the whole mess. And they were ready to go. They didn't have any problem with it. They were on board 100%. And they were more than ready to depart and start a life anew. They were willing to go along with their husband and put themselves under the divine direction of his God. What do they say? They said, "Whatever God hath said unto thee, do." Now that's a pretty good comment. That's a pretty good feedback, if you will, that if you trust your husband to be living a righteous life, you trust him to be in tune with the Lord, you feel like he's got a relationship with God, and that God is, that he is on God's side and God's on his side, then you can make that statement. If he says that, hey, God's told me to do this or that thing, then you can make that statement clearly and honestly. Whatsoever God hath said unto thee, do. Don't let us stand in the way, Jacob. We don't want to be a hindrance to what God's got for your life. Rather, we want to be part of it and we want to be supportive of it. And there's no better feeling than know your mate is behind you 100% when you're trying to fulfill the will of God. So that's really a great statement. It's a statement of faith, and it's a statement of commitment. And the principle here to be observed is those wives that are their husband's meat, their helpmeets, will never be hindrances in doing that which God calls them to do. If they are a hindrance, then they're not much of a helper to their husband, but rather they're more concerned about themselves or their own circumstances than they are about fulfilling what God has for them to do. So it appears that he desired to fulfill the will of God, but he still felt it was in his and his family's best interest just to not confront Laban again. And there's several reasons for that. One is he's already tried to confront him one time, and Laban convinced him to stay on. And so he's afraid that that's going to happen again, because Laban definitely doesn't want him to leave. Even though he's not feeling good about the ways things are turning out, he's probably still thinking that somehow he's going to get the upper hand and he's going to get his property back, either by force or by trickery. He's going to still try to recover his property. That's what he's going to be thinking. And his sons are on board with that too. And then the other thing is just the fact that he could possibly hold his daughters hostage. He could probably say, well, my daughters aren't leaving. You can go, but they're not going. So if you want the family to go, you're going to have to stay here. So there's many things that he could be fearing that Laban would try to do. And so he felt like basically it was the best thing to do and the safest thing to do just to not tell them they're leaving. Just to pack their bags, head out, and hopefully by the time Laban discovers what's happened, they'll be far away enough that there won't be any further fear about it or further discussion needed. So he was basically going to do it behind the back of Laban. And, he didn't feel like there was any approval needed from their father. I mean, they'd already laid that out, that they weren't concerned about talking to their father about it. They weren't concerned about getting their father's approval. They weren't concerned about getting his, hand of direction on them anymore, because they felt like, pretty much the same way that Jacob did. And so what do we read here? Well, it says that Laban was busy doing what he does. It says that Laban went to shear his sheep. So he was, wherever they sheared him at, wherever the fold was, or possibly they had a shed somewhere, possibly they just had to go out to where the sheep were. They had to go out in the field and find them where they were, and that's where they would shear them at. And so he was out and about. He was nowhere to be found anyway. He was probably out, he could have been camping out or sleeping in a tent or whatever the case was. And if you remember, there was already some distance between their families because it was a 3 days journey. So the word wouldn't get to them in any expedient amount of time. They would have some lead time, you might say. And, Laban was out doing business, so he wasn't concerned about them at this point in time either. So it would take time for Laban to get the word of their departure. And perhaps by the time he was informed, they would be well on their way and hopefully wouldn't have to face any conflict or reaction. And Jacob felt well justified in his leaving, concerning the animosity that had now existed between their two groups. And the fact that his leaving was sanctioned by the Lord. He was leaving by direction for safety and to avoid further conflict that he felt was brewing and would soon come to a head. Jacob did not want to once again be hindered, and he didn't want to be plundered in the sense that Laban or his sons might very well try to take back some of his animals by force, especially if he knew they were leaving. But the family issues were not finished, and so departure would not be smooth. So what do we see in verse 19? Well, it says that Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. Rachel had decided to take something with her. Maybe it was treated as a memento. Maybe it was treated as a reminder. Maybe these were something that were, near and dear to her father that she wanted to hold on to for remembrance. But it could be pretty likely that maybe she was doing it out of spite, because she knew how important these images were to her father. And by taking those, perhaps she was just kind of like putting her thumb in his eye. And that very well could have been the case. But for whatever reason, that's what she did. She took him, and she took him unawares to Jacob. Jacob did not know that she had these images. He didn't know she was taking those. So she packed them away and put them in her suitcase and had them, hidden away. And so she might have wanted to have it as an heirloom, but she might have just felt that the item was going to be hers eventually anyway. And since they were leaving the country, she just didn't want to leave them behind. And so, yeah, it might have been spoken to that end. Maybe your father had brought it up at some point in time and said, I'm going to bequeath these to you one day, or whenever you go off on your own, I want you to take these with you. He could have said that. But the problem was that the items at hand were not given to her, and they belonged to her father, and she took them without his permission. So the Bible just plainly lays it out and says she stole them. And a lot of times folks will take things from people and they'll try to justify it. And it could be even family members. They leave the home and, maybe they move out, children or whoever, and, they're given a certain amount of things, but maybe they take something that didn't really have their name written on it. It wasn't necessarily intended for them to take it, but they felt justified because they just felt like it should belong to them. And there's a lot of things that happen that way in our society, and sometimes it's bigger things. It could be cars, it could be, it could be stereos, TVs, people, maybe it was boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever, and they break up, and then somebody takes some of the stuff with them, and they feel like, well, they didn't treat me so good, and they knew that this was really belonged to me anyway, because we both paid for it, or we both paid the electricity to run it, or whatever. And so they just take it without having a formal agreement, without even asking the other person, and then before you know it, they're both in court trying to figure out who this thing really belongs to. And so that's what it is, and the Bible just spells it out. It says that she stole them because they didn't belong to her, and they were not given to her. They were not assigned to her. And so just what were these items? Well, the Bible tells us they were images, and they were some kind of small statues or representations. And it could have been, there was idol worship going on everywhere at that time. I mean, even up in the land there of Mesopotamia. And we know that. We read those accounts, especially down in Canaan. There was plenty of idol worshiping going on. And, a lot of times people that claim to be Christian will still, you might still find a good luck charm in their house. Might find a horseshoe they tacked up on the wall. Or you might find a little, they used to have these things called wish dolls, the little wish dolls. Or you might find a Buddha statue that they just picked up at the store, or maybe they picked it up while they were overseas and they feel like it's, maybe they could think it's just an archaeological thing or a cool thing to have, or they could think that possibly it could bring them some good luck or something. But there's all kinds of, even nowadays, well-meaning Christians can have these images in their house and not think much of it. But, the Bible has some things to say about that. In fact, one of the 10 Commandments tells us that we're not to have any graven images. And those things can be a stumbling block, but they can also be a hindrance to our fellowship with God, and they can interfere with our relationship because sometimes we're still assigning some kind of power or faith to those things when God deserves all the power and faith from us that, He deserves it alone. He's the creator. These images were man-made things that have no power. So for whatever reason, she decided to take these with her. And, so they might not necessarily have been God's idols. The word here, the Greek word or the Hebrew word is teraphim. And it usually refers to something to do with the family. So, before, since this was before the days of cameras, I mean, it could have been a carved image of an ancestor, or it could have been a carved image of a family member, a great patriarch or something, and something that just meant a lot to the whole family, not necessarily just her father. It could have been something that was handed down through generations and had been secured by her father, and that she didn't want to leave him behind. She didn't want to let it go. And maybe she even felt that maybe they wouldn't even be missed. Maybe she felt like that he never really paid attention to them anyway, so he wouldn't notice if they were gone. Or by the time he noticed they were gone, we'd be long gone. But it's possible they were some image that should bring good luck, and that she felt in some way they could be beneficial to their journey to the new country. Maybe for good protection and safety, and sort of like, a St. Christopher, or some kind of it could be something hanging from a chain, or something, little statue that you put up in the corner, or whatever, that you feel like it's going to give you, I know overseas, you'll see a lot of these countries where they'll have the little Buddhas, and every taxi driver, every car will have one somewhere in their car, because that's going to be their benefit for protection while they're traveling, while they're doing their daily activities, as that little statue is going to give them a blessing, and going to give them protection and safety. And so they'll have that in their car, and they take it very seriously, and they really put a lot of faith in those images to give them that hedge of protection. So it's possible, these are all possibilities, but anyway, the next thing we see is they leave on their journey, and they tried to stay under the wire. But, the event wasn't going to keep secret, so word immediately transferred over to Laban. He was going to get contacted. They were going to get a head start, and it was going to be about 3 days before he knew what had taken place. And so word would travel to Laban, but it would take us time to get there. And when he got this word, it really upset him. It made him mad. He got angry. And he wasn't going to take it lightly, and he wasn't going to take it sitting down. Because what do we see? Well, first of all, we know that he wasn't expecting this. Now, he felt duped. Not only by somebody, but by his own family, even his own daughters. Not a goodbye, didn't get a goodbye, didn't get a kiss from his daughters, didn't even get a courtesy of them checking in with him to make sure all things were relegated and made straight. And so it was that Jacob now had a 3-day head start to escape once and for all and fulfill the word of the Lord by returning to Canaan. And so we see the next chain of events. Laban's not going to take this sitting down. His ire is up. His neck has been stiffened, and he needs to settle this matter, and he needs to do it face to face. So what does he do? Well, he gathers his brethren together, and he pursues Jacob. And how mad is he? Well, we see that he pursues him for 7 days. But obviously, him and his cohorts don't have the hindrances of children and families and all the animals, so they can make time. They can make better time. And I don't know if, I guess they were riding the camels, however fast the camels can move. But they don't have a lot of baggage and luggage to hold them down, so they can gain momentum. They can gain, the distance. They can close that distance between them. And so he pursued him for 7 days. And he would eventually catch up to him. And he says, I'm going to catch up and I'm going to settle this matter. And the Bible tells us that he overtook him in the Mount Gilead. But before he could confront Jacob directly, God spoke to Laban in a dream the night before. What does he tell him? He says, take heed that thou speak not to Jacob either good or bad. Wow. So the Lord's going to intervene, because Laban's just mad enough that he might do something serious. He might do some harm to him. And he may, he's been having 7 days to dwell on this thing and to, really be formulating some things in his mind. But God intervened on Jacob's behalf and basically threatened Laban and gave him an ultimatum. And he says, take heed, Laban. You better listen up. You don't speak to Jacob either good or bad. And, Laban was in hot pursuit. He felt he had a just cause. He felt slighted, and he wasn't going to give up easily. But now he knows that the same God that had blessed him before now has rebuked him and gave him a fair warning. And so he was going to be chastised by God, so he better be careful in his dealings with Jacob on what he said and what he did. And basically, he should say nothing against or for his departure, because it was the Lord's will. In other words, he'd better reduce his rage, reduce his anger, and be civil with Jacob. He would be allowed to confront him on the nature of his departure, but not on the departure itself, because that was of the Lord. Well, we're going to stop there, and we'll pick it up next time in verses 25 through 35. And we're going to see now the encounter that Laban's going to have with Jacob, how that's going to turn out, and what they're going to do. And we're going to see what the result also is of what Rachel did. And there's going to be some things to come out of that as well. So we'll see that next time. Hope you're having a great day.